Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on which part of the world you are joining us from. Thank you for joining us again today for the partner briefing titled Differentiate Yourself, Extend Zero Trust Network Access to both remote and on-premises users. I'm John Atchison, Head of Global Partner Marketing here at Versa Networks. Joining us today is Kevin Xu, Vice President of Product Marketing. I've also invited John Taylor to the call to help us answer any question. John, or known as JT as well, is the Director and Principal of Security at Versa Networks. So together we're gonna answer all of your questions. Please feel free to ask the questions via the Q&A button. Also, I want to just let you know that today's webinar is being recorded and it's going to be made available on demand following today's session. We will provide you with a link to Versa Academy, which is our learning portal that you can also get information where this webinar will also be available. And also to minimize any background noise, all participants will be in listen-only mode. Again, however, we want this session to be interactive. You can submit your questions via the Q&A button that's located at the bottom of your screen. We will go through all the questions during the call. So now I'll turn it over to Kevin. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, John, and welcome everybody. It's great to be here and have this discussion with you. Today's discussion that John, and I will host will be focused on how we can help you differentiate yourself in your discussions, as well as how you can accelerate and also expand the size of your deals when you're having a ZTNA discussion. In particular, how the new behaviors of the workforce, whether they're remote, in the office, or somewhere in between, give you an opportunity to help you in your deal cycle, in your sales cycle. The way that we frame this discussion, well, first, let us give you a little bit of background on the dynamics of how the workforce has changed and why that drives a new way of thinking about zero trust network access. Then we talk a bit about best practices when thinking about how you support them. And then finally, we'll close out with how your sales motion can be adjusted and the sales tools that you have at your disposal when you're having those discussions. So first, it's helpful for us to level set on why we think about zero trust as our security framework of choice. It's good for us to think about how we got to where we are today. If we think about the last 10 years or so, zero trust has increasingly gained adoption. And a large part of that are the dynamics of how things have moved, whether it's data, people, or applications. Because before, you could build a perimeter around your locations and then double down on it. So you put your firewall in, double down with better IDS, IPS, double down with better threat intelligence, double down with advanced threat protection and sandboxing. And that always worked because you always knew where everything was. Your data, your people, your apps were always inside of those locations. Now, gradually, especially first with digital transformation, and then eventually with things like mobility, you start to see things move outside of that perimeter. And for a while, that we could manage it because those things could be exceptions. But over time, eventually, so many apps moved to the cloud, and eventually there were so many mobile devices that were being used, and then work from home became a thing. And then the tipping point ultimately came with COVID. With COVID, everything actually moved outside of the perimeter. And so eventually we reached a point where you really were operating in an environment where there was no perimeter anymore. You couldn't assume that everything was inside of that location. And so by nature of that, the only way you could secure everything was to verify and authenticate and authorize every individual interaction between either users, devices, or applications. And that's where zero trust comes into play. It takes away any trust that you might have implicitly and requires you to explicitly garner the trust that's required. And it's continued to gain steam. Today, we see that most companies are either already implementing zero trust, whether they're in the early stages or in the latter stages, or perhaps this is where a big part of your opportunity sits. a lot are starting to evaluate and think about what those opportunities might look like, whether it's segmentation, whether it's by nature of how they access those SaaS apps, or what the focus of today's discussion is then ZTNA, how you then provide security constructs on how you access private applications. Now, ZTNA specifically is a part of Zero Trust, and ZTNA gives you the technology construct for enforcing those least privilege policies that are required in Zero Trust. It means it assumes that the underlying network can't be trusted. The way that you give control to things is based on things like identity, context. You always assume that it's untrusted underneath the network. And by nature of that, you have to continually verify that each access, but also each access that's been given is continually verified and assessed, but also you make sure that devices that are accessing it are continually assessed. And by nature of that, it also implicitly means that your location doesn't quite matter. All that matters is who that's accessing it and the private application that you're trying to access. And this really has gained steam over the last 2 years. As people had to go remote, work from home, it became the construct for replacing VPNs, because VPNs, while they initially worked for a while because of that initial construct we talked about, where you could trust everything inside of your locations. But once you're remote and everything is moving around, what it meant was that it would break. You had a one-time authentication, you weren't checking for compromise, and once somebody could get access into the network, they had pretty free access to move around. And ZTNA became the mechanism to always continually verify, you always check on the security posture of the devices, and then most importantly, it ensures that you're enforcing zero trust, least privilege access policies when trying to access and be given permission to those private applications. Now, a nuance started to occur over the last year or two, namely, people weren't entirely remote anymore. So as we started to exit the pandemic, we started to see more and more people return back into the office. Now, it's not a clean return to the office. We have folks that remain remote. We have folks that return to the office. And then you have people who are a little bit of both. So for instance, this morning, I'm going to be working from home. I'm taking this call from home. But then later today, I'm going to be in the office. And you have folks that actually span both ends of the spectrum. And in fact, most forecasts assume that the majority of the workforce in the upcoming year or two are actually going to be hybrid workers. And so it raises a question, how do you necessarily secure not just your remote users when you're trying to access that private app? What do you do when people return back into the office? Because it's not necessarily the same. By nature of me having moved, it means that there's some different dynamics that you have to take into account. First, the way that I get access to my campus network is akin to how we thought about the VPN. Like we use NACs, and NACs give you open access into the network. So there's no app level controls, there's no device level controls. And then once you get into the network, in this example that you see in front of you, even if you're just trying to access a simple private app that's been deployed like Confluence, you actually have fairly open access to everything else that's inside of the network. So it's actually the same problem that we had when we were talking about the VPN use case. And so it causes a couple of problems. I mean, for the first case, of course, it's just less secure. You're not deploying and enforcing zero trust policies when accessing that private app. But if you think about that hybrid worker, it also means that for the same user and the same identity, you have inconsistent security depending on where the user is. So the example I gave where I'm at home today and then I'm returning back to the office later, like for somebody like me, my security posture is actually inconsistent because I'm sitting at home. I use zero trust to enforce how I access those private apps. I go into the office and suddenly I don't have these privilege controls that are in place. And for the administrator, this is fairly complicated as well because it's a mindset shift. And it's also two tools that I have to worry about. So one, I have to think about how I enforce zero trust policies, and then the person shifts, and then suddenly I have to think about it in a different way. And then also it means that you're actually using two different tools. And that means that you may have inconsistent security, or you may actually have lapses in the lifecycle management of how these tools operate and the policies that you've set. And in addition to that, that ultimately means like if I want to secure and deploy ZTNA for my private apps, I also don't have a whole lot of choices in front of me. I either go with the status quo and not have ZTNA for my campus network, or on the other hand, I take the solution that I had for remote ZTNA access. But the thing is, if I use that option that I have, you end up with unnatural performance and unnatural routing behaviors, not to mention you're not able to enforce traffic in the line of traffic. So in the example that we talked about before, I'm just trying to access a private app that might be sitting right next to me. In order for me to get an enforcement decision, I actually have to go all the way out to the cloud. I'm actually leaving my campus in order to get a decision and then come back in order to get access to that private app. So a little bit complicated and not ideal. And that's where zero trust everywhere comes into play, and Versa's approach to ZTNA really comes into play because it takes into account the scenario where a user is both remote but also on campus. And we'll dive into that a little bit, but ultimately what you're left with is ZTNA access for private apps when you're on the campus. And you're also left with consistent security. So that challenge you had where just because I move, I have mindset shift and I have two different tools. Now I can consolidate it into one administrative experience and one user experience as well. Now, what does that look like as a product? I mean, for us, there's two ways to think about. There's both the products that encompass the solution for that problem, and then we also wrap it under an entire umbrella as a full story, and I'll talk about why that necessarily is. So as a matter of the product, there's both a zero trust network access solution. So those two boxes that you see on the left, we have one solution for somebody who's sitting remote. And then we have our new ZT-Prem solution that's designed for people who are in the campus itself. And both of those are managed and reported under our same management console. We also have a second product, our Versa Secure SD-LAN solution. This allows you to deploy ZTNA solutions on the campus network itself in the path of traffic. So it allows you to take ZTNA as close to the user as possible. And we do wrap this all under a singular zero trust everywhere story. And we want to talk about as well why we want to talk about it in that way, because this solution as a whole kind of gives you those two benefits. It allows you to have ZTNA on the campus itself. It also allows you to enforce ZTNA inline in the path of traffic. And mainly because it's a competitive solution. We wanted to give you a position that is differentiated and allows you to have a different discussion with your customers. So if you think about what other companies out there are doing, there might be some that tell you that they have access to the campus and can deploy things in the campus itself. There are others that tell you that they can do ZTNA for on-campus users. No other vendor out there can tell you that they're deploying ZTNA in the campus itself in the path of traffic. And so for if you think about ZTNA itself, if you think about, in fact, maybe I'll just blow this out for a second. If you think about the network, you'll see a lot of SSE anchored companies. But these SSE anchored companies, they can't deploy ZTNA in the campus in the line of in the path of traffic. And if you think about the networking companies that have access to the campus network itself, to the switches itself, Most don't have the capability to think about and enforce ZTNA. So this gives you flexibility to both differentiate, but also in a lot of cases allows you to future-proof and accelerate and expand your sales motion. Speaking of sales motion, there's two considerations we wanted to make sure that you're aware of. First is the customer profile that will be interested in this. And then the second is the potential deployment options. Now, you have two different options potentially converging after both. Of course, for ZT premises, if you're talking about ZTNA on-prem, this solution is geared towards the security practitioner. So you want to look for the CISO, the VP of security operations, the security architect that will think about how you expand and support that ZTNA use case for the hybrid worker. You can also target the network team as well. This can be the CIO, the network operations, the network architect, because SD-LAN versus secure SD-LAN is an option that they might find interesting standalone, but it also gives them a mechanism to deploy ZTNA in the campus itself. And for them, of course, better security, you get the benefits of modernizing SD-LAN, modernizing the switches, but also if they're an SD-WAN customer, it gives them a mechanism to extend the fabric and the edge into the campus itself and give you a lot of performance benefits, not to mention you can actually unify a lot of the reporting configuration mechanisms that they may already have in place today. And then perhaps on that note, we did want to quickly mention as well, when we talk about ZTNA on-prem on the campus itself, there's actually two places you can deploy it. You can deploy it onto that Versa Secure SD-LAN, and then also you can deploy it on a WAN edge as well. So if there's a Versa customer that already has SD-WAN deployed, they can also put ZT-Prem on that device as well. It's just an additional license. So with that, we do want to close out with a few best practices for where you might want to think about looking for opportunities, where the budgets might sit as you're thinking about how this best fits into the conversations that you're having with your customers. So we talked first about kind of the key needs and the key pain points that are coming with the hybrid worker, how we have to think about zero trust and the administrator experience as well, and the consistency between on-campus and remote users. There's a couple of budgets where you'll typically find this. There's, of course, with ZTNA, you want to look for those zero trust initiatives. They often have budgets that are incorporated into their ZTNA deployments, and this fits in well with that. In line with that, you also can look for VPN replacement opportunities as well if they have VPNs that are being replaced. Don't just think about remote users, think about hybrid users, and it's a way for you to differentiate yourself as you're having that discussion. Digital transformation initiatives are good places to look as well. Now, these tend to be initially focused on productivity and operational benefits, but very few are deployed without security in mind. And so you can look for that as well. And not to be forgotten are also cross-sell opportunities into your existing base. So for those who have Versa's VSPA solution, so that's our ZTNA solution for remote users, there's an opportunity to expand that sale into the for users who are returning back into the office. And also for SD-WAN users, a lot will find benefit in being able to extend the modernization of their edge from just the WAN into the LAN. And we talked a bit about the capabilities that are tied with that. John, I'll hand it over to you to talk about some of the resources that the teams have available to them as they're thinking about how they can look for opportunities and the tools that they have at their disposal.
Great, thank you, Kevin. Okay, so I just wanted to let you know we do have lots of different resources that are available to you, again, via the partner portal. And I did provide you in the chat box a URL to partner portal. If you don't have access to it, please register. And it is partners.versa-networks.com. The assets that are available here, as you can see from this slide, whether it's a data sheet, solution brief, white paper, It's available to you. These are the direct links to these different assets that we have available to you as well, along with the press release and the blog. If we go to the next slide, the next slide provides you just lots of different SASE partner resources that are available today. Again, many of these different assets I provided you to make it as easy as possible to get to the information with a direct link to the resource. As you can see, there's whether it's access to Gartner reports or white papers, which many of your customers are probably really keen on getting their hands on. You can actually download these assets, make them available. In fact, I have some partners that actually use some of these Gartner reports in front of a gated form. So they use that as a way to generate demand and leads for themselves. So certainly leverage these assets. If you have any questions, certainly reach out to your channel manager. If we go to the next slide, as far as call to action or next steps, contact your Versa channel account manager. And if for some reason you don't know who that person is, you can always reach out to my team at partner-marketing@versa-networks.com. And we will be more than happy to assist you, put you in contact with your field representative. With this Zero Trust Everywhere announcement, there are a lot of opportunities out there for ZTNA. So be sure to look at those opportunities. Certainly look for VPN replacement opportunities that are out there, and leverage us for customer conversations or opportunity discussions here in the field. Again, going back to Versa Partner Portal, as a partner, you have access to all of the resources that are available to you. And certainly deal registration is one of the benefits that we have that gives you a 10% incremental discount for various products. So definitely take advantage of that. There are other resources like our lab environment that's available to you, whether it's for training, labs, for testing, certifications, or demos, that's available to you as well. Again, if you don't know who your partner representative is, please reach out to our alias, partner-marketing@versa-networks.com, and we will be more than happy to get back to you. There are like 3 different questions that came in. So I'll take the first one, and it's around, will you make the presentation deck along with the recording available? Will that be available? The answer is yes. So following today's webinar, I'm going to share with you a PDF version of the deck along with the recording. Feel free to share that with your colleagues in the event that they were not able to attend. Now, today's webinar was purposely very short and sweet, and we wanted to provide you some high-level information. Again, there are a lot of resources that are available to you, but we will probably have a more in-depth webinar that's going to follow in the very near future that's going to provide you more details. But for now, certainly reach out to your channel account manager for any additional questions that you may have. Another question is, Kevin, if you could could you provide us a little bit information on who are we competing with when it comes to ZTNA?
Yeah, I can certainly do that. And then JT, I think I'll provide the overall kind of category view, and then if you could provide some additional context. So I think the competitors that you'll generally see in large blocks or large categories will be either folks who have deployed ZTNA in the cloud. And so that's the use case where you take a ZTNA solution that was designed for remote users and then try and apply it to both remote and on-campus users. So I think that's where the challenge will be, that it's not in line in the path of traffic, and you're not taking Zero Trust as close to the user as possible. And so for networking, a lot of these campus switching companies, they're going to, for a lot of those SSE anchored companies, that will be their challenge. I think the other competitive group that you're going to see are campus networking companies. And their challenge will be their construct and their expertise will be focused on switching. but they're going to have weakness when it comes to thinking about how you enforce zero trust network access. And in particular, like while they can help you with the campus, what happens when people actually become hybrid, or what happens when they become remote users? So those are kind of two broad strokes categories that I think you're going to see the most. John, anything else to add there?
There's a couple things to actually add there, right? So one of the big things, right, when we're looking at something like a ZTNA and kind of what we're talking about and what we're bringing to market here at Versa is where as Kevin said, the SSE vendors are just one piece of that pie, right? We are definitely going to be going up against a lot of the traditional switch vendors that are out there, because we are adding this right to the local LAN. So we're going to be going up against the larger competitors, right, and so forth in that realm, and as well as NAC providers too, right? Because the difference is that we're not looking to bring in a separate NAC solution, right? We're not necessarily looking to bring in something where we offshore, right? Or we actually bring out of the environment that authentication authorization, side of the house. That's the ZTNA, portion on-prem. That's where Kevin was talking about bringing that in line, right? Being able to have that in the path of traffic is we're making the switch, right? We're making that, the point where the user and device connects to, the policy enforcement and the policy decision point, right? That's not saying that we cannot play with existing NAC solutions. We can absolutely integrate with them utilizing, 802.1x, right? And stuff like that. But this is a solution, right, at the end of the day, that is meant to be all encompassing. So it would be roadmap, right, for a customer if they already have a solution like that. How do we actually work to like roll them out of that NAC solution and bring them into a solidified or a unified ZTNA based solution?
So I'll start pulling a few questions along the way here as well. So John, maybe you can take this one as well, and then we'll take the reverse order this time. You can take it first, and then I'll follow on. So, John, there's a question around how complicated a deployment might be, and I think there's actually two questions on the line, and so I'll sort of put my own interpretation on it. But how complicated is it to do a VPN replacement? Because I frame it that way because I know you just did a webinar on the topic. And then the second is then how complicated is it to deploy, period? So if you could take that one, I might add a thought or two afterwards.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. So believe it or not, it's really not that complicated, right? When you really think about it. And it's like any other deployment, right? A well thought out, well planned deployment, right? Well planned migration, right? Usually goes pretty smooth. So that's I would say that's the very first thing we have to look at when we're looking at customers that are interested in either, Kevin, what you talked about, whether it be a VPN replacement or even extending this, down to what we've talked about with being at the wire. So it really is planning, right, and really kind of looking at making sure that you're evaluating the solution based upon company needs, right? Your customers are doing that. They're they're taking into account, right, certain do's and don'ts, right? We do have a blog post that's getting ready to come out, around that and so forth from a high level, so your customers can definitely read it. But realistically, it's as long as you're doing something very methodically, it's very simplistic, right, to be able to roll out. There are differences, right? So let's call that first, right? To adopt a ZTNA solution as well as potentially migrate to a ZTNA solution and so forth, right? The differences usually come back in. This isn't a network-based solution, right? Yes, we're still giving them some type of network access. We're still giving them something there, to be able to access applications, but we're really trying to bring that up a level. So we have to think, right, on a different layer of the OSI model, right? We have to think in the application side. We just can't think about it from a network perspective. And that's usually where a lot of customers get tripped up, is because they're so used to that legacy. Hey, I just need to be able to give, someone network access, whether it's in-house, right? It's behind my firewall, or being able to give them, access from the remote edge.
And probably the one additional comment I'll add on top of that is, it's one thing to think about the deployment mode, deployment and rip and place. The other then is to think about the ease of use once you have it deployed as well, because now you don't have two tools that you have to think about when you're thinking about your ZTNA options, whether it's because you have NAC and then cloud-based ZTNA, or whether it's because you have two different ZTNA solutions. Now you have one unified mechanism to enforce and configure those policies. So I see another question on the line as well. So the question is on where the best opportunities sit. And so perhaps this is an opportunity for me just to kind of double click on some of the original thoughts that we had. And then JT, maybe in case I've missed anything, please add some context here as well. But I think, a cross-sell is likely an easy and early place to look if you already have Versa customers in place. This is either an extension of your VSPA or an extension of SD-LAN for those that are looking to extend the software definition of their network. That I think would be the first place to consider. And then I think there's several different types of initiatives and budgets to look after. But JT, any additional ones that you think might be interesting to look into?
Realistically, I always say, right, from a technical aspect, always look at, your technical requirements, right, across the board. Make sure everything fits, right? Make sure that, when you're evaluating, these things that you absolutely are picking the right solution, right? So as you're guiding your customers, right, into a solution, be mindful, right? Look at what, their requirements are, right? Let's not just look at a solution that could probably fit in the short term. Always look at what's down the road, right? Let's make sure that, whatever they may have, right? If they have a short term, need for something, right? Let's make sure it always fits into a 5-year solution, right? Or a 3-year solution or something like that. So, it's one of those things that solutions such as this, right, are meant to really be, it's really meant to be a foundational element, right, when it comes down to starting a zero trust journey, right, or something of that nature. So this is going to be a cornerstone for your customers. Just as NAC has always been a cornerstone for customers, just as remote access VPN, right, has become a cornerstone for customers, and now ZTNA, this is going to be in that same realm.
And actually, one additional thought I'll add as well. It's an example from one of our partners. You may not need or deploy both both VSPA and ZT-Prem initially, but you can use it as a mechanism to ensure that your customers are future-proofed, because maybe today you deploy VSPA, but what you don't want to do is to deploy a solution for remote users 2 years down the road, realize you need to support hybrid or on-prem users, and suddenly have to get a second box, a second product in order to properly do it. So it's a mechanism for you to differentiate the product, but also making sure that you're looking at a product that ensures that you're not in an awkward position to have to either rip and replace or have to manage two products 2 years down the road.
A couple of more questions came in, so if I can go ahead and read it to you guys, and then we'll go from there. The first one again is with regards to ZTNA. Since it is a software-only license on an existing hardware for SD-WAN, CPE, or LAN switches, does your solution address MFA only based on app or more?
You mean to take that, Kevin?
Yeah, if you could take that one.
So our solution addresses MFA in multiple different ways, right? So, if I don't quite get it right, I'm assuming that the question is asking, do we address it, via the app, right? That's, because we do have to have a client, right, that's loaded onto the machine, and or do we address it from an application, specific side, right? Like if you're trying to get to something like SFDC, or you're trying to get to an internal application or something like that. So I'll try to answer it both ways. So starting with the client, right, that's on the machine. So we do address MFA in such a way that your client, right, because since it's the same way as remote access, we're bringing that same technology to the wire, but your client does actually pass all of that, authentication credentials there, right? So if you're utilizing your username and password, a SAML token, right, we're doing dynamic contextual controls as well, where we're actually looking at the machine, we're understanding, things like Windows or Mac revs, right? From operating system perspective, we're understanding, things like, your your antivirals, right? Your EPP or EDR based solution, something like that. So we're really trying to take that, right, and we're actually applying that internally, where a lot of, current NAC solutions, right, just don't do that today, right? It's either you're on, right, you're doing a legacy 802.1x and you're kind of off, or you're off the network. The other side, right, is looking at MFA for applications. So we don't directly interact with the application itself, right? We're looking, right, from our solution to be able to give you, connectivity, right, and provide the path to be able to get to that app. So we're going to map you to that app, right? At the end of the day, it's still up for that app, right, to be able to take credentials, right, whether it's an SSO or something like that, for your machine to be able to pass that across as it always has. All we're doing is giving you access to the medium to be able to access that app. We're not actually trying to interfere or be a man in the middle or try to pass those credentials, right, to that app for you to be able to authenticate against that application.
Great.
All right. And so I think, and John, I'll go ahead and just close out the questions for
Great,
the
thank you.
groups. So I think there's just one final question that maybe we'll just give a general answer, unless JP you want to go a second level deeper, but then it might be one that we end up taking offline. But there's a general question. In fact, there's a couple of different questions on NAC integrations, and I will just offer up that we do have integrations of choice that are in place. Of course, if you reach out to your partner representative, we'll be able to help you get more details on each of those. But JT, I'm not sure if there's any additional details that's worth sharing, since each individual use case may be very specific. But just know that we have those integrations in place, and we can both replace the NAC, but also operate with the NAC in place as well. JT, anything else to add?
The only thing I'll say, right, is that, most NAC providers, right, that are out there today utilize open standard protocols, right? Like I mentioned 802.1x, that's been an industry standard, for almost 2 decades now, if not longer. And so what I will say is that, if someone's utilizing a NAC solution, as long as they're utilizing, open standards and so forth, right, we can easily integrate with that, right? Whether it be things like, radius authentication, right, or something of that nature, right? They're utilizing something a little bit different. But to Kevin's point, putting in something like a NAC solution, right, or putting in something that is, or adopting a ZTNA, or migrating from a NAC, right, or even starting this journey from scratch really is customer specific, right? And so it really kind of comes down to, what are the customer requirements? What is their journey? What is their vision, right? At the end of the day, where do they really want to be, right, in 30 days, right, in 60 days, and 6 months from now, right? And then moving into the 1, 3, and 5 year mark, right? Where do they really want to sit? And then that's where the solution, right, really kind of becomes more like a Swiss Army knife, where with ZTNA solutions, you can easily, right, and especially with the Versa solution, mold this to what the customer really needs. It's not something that, you have to come in and say, the customer beats their hand on the ground and says, I have a NAC solution, right? I have to use that NAC solution. It's the grandest thing in the world. Great. We want to be able to conform to that, right? But we also want to be able to potentially show a customer, right, when time of renewals and things like that happen, that, hey, look, they do have other options that are out there, and see if that does meet their requirements.
Wonderful. All right, John, I think that does it for all the questions. Of course, we'll double check after the fact in case we've missed anything, but John, we'll hand it back to you.
Thank you. Yes, those are all of the questions. If you have any additional questions, please be sure to reach out to your channel manager, or alternatively, any of us here on the call. I'll be sure to include our email addresses in the communications that's going to go out shortly after this webinar. Again, thank you for your time. We appreciate attending the webinar, and well, until next time, thank you.